I'm Sarah Jackson, host of Internal Comms Pro, the podcast, a listening experience choreographed to help you elevate your internal communications to the pro level.
This is a moment of reckoning. This right now is a moment that we're called upon to be leaders.
And inclusion isn't just about formal inclusion processes. Inclusion is about asking people questions who don't normally get asked and then acting on their answers when they don't normally get acted on.
If you truly want to communicate in a way that is inclusive, is to understand what is my worldview? How do I think about this topic?
We need to start upskilling ourselves to cope with the new world. We can't keep on depending on clicks and views or number of visits, for example. I think the future for internal comms is for us to upskill ourselves from a data analysis and from a critical point of view and analytical point of view as well.
Hello, folks. Today, we continue our DEI journey with 4 experts from all around the world. Today, we start with Ann and Dorianne, 2 amazing women who've partnered together to navigate diversity, equity, and inclusion to positively impact the workplace. There are so many layers to this episode, and we peel back each one, and we'll end up all the way across the world to London and even Iceland, where we meet 2 experts whose communication hat strategy provides the organizing framework needed to apply all of today's DEI lessons. Let's jump in as we learn how to craft the DEI conversation to impact workplace culture.
My name is Dorianne St Fleur, and I'm a workplace inclusion consultant and racial equity strategist at Dorianne St Fleur Consulting.
And I'm Ann Melinger. I am the CEO of a consultancy called Brilliant Inc., and we focus on employee engagement and internal communications.
Well, I can't thank you enough for both taking the time out of your day to talk about one of our top most requested issues and things that our listeners are struggling with. As you know, 2020 just had so much turbulence, and our internal communicators are internally struggling with how to reckon inequality and racial injustice in their workplace, and they don't know where to go. And so I thought, I don't have to be an expert in this, but I can call on the experts and bring voices to people who are doing this work to help guide us through some of these questions today.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I've known for a while that my company, Brilliant Inc., we have suffered from a lack of diversity. And it's something that I've been aware of for quite a while. For a long time, I think I've been really proud of building a team that has been largely comprised of women, many of whom are women who are also moms. As the spring and summer, and especially with the murder of George Floyd, something inside me really shifted. And I felt like there was this voice that I had been pushing to the side a little too much, broke through. And I started asking myself some much harder questions, like why aren't more people of color interested in joining my company? And, you know, how has this lack of diversity been holding us back? And, we've been successful on many measures, but we could probably be much more successful if we had different perspectives and ideas in the mix. So I reached out to about 20 different consultants and I interviewed about a dozen of them, just all really trying to understand what can I do and where do I need to go on my journey. And very quickly decided that I wanted to partner with Dorianne on this work. One of the things that she helped me understand right off the bat is that training for my team was a really good place to start, but it was definitely not the end. And really, she worked with me to dig into my personal experiences, my personal connections. And that's been just a really important part of the journey for me.
Well, it speaks a lot of Dorianne to interview 20 and that she hit the top. So I'm glad that we got your top choice. Dorianne, talk to us about that interaction and what that was like when Ann, reached out to you.
For me, when I spoke with Anne, there was just this feeling of self awareness, this feeling of authenticity, and this just the vibe that I got that I'm ready to do the work. And I know that sounds so like, what does that mean, do the work? But I just intangibly I could feel that whatever we needed to do in this journey, that Anne was ready to do that. And it was just important for me, and this is important for anyone who is really embarking on this journey of anti-racism, of inclusion, equity, that you are committing to do whatever it takes to build a culture that where all of your employees, specifically and in particular people of color, people from historically underrepresented groups, can feel like they belong.
I love that. How did you kind of get there and work through, both of you, to have the courage? Because I think that's the first step. And that's what I hear a lot of our internal communication listeners say, that of the pushback they're getting from their companies, that no, we're not going to say anything now because, we've never spoken on this before and now we're going to look like jerks. What's something that they can say to get over that hump so they can start to do the work?
If I can start here, I just feel like that response, while I understand, please don't misunderstand, I get it, and I get where that's coming from. In this time, we got to get over ourselves. Like, we have to get over, oh my gosh, what are people going to think? Because the truth is, whether you do or whether you don't, people are going to think things about you. If I see an organization that has said nothing, has done nothing, if I'm working for an organization, I have conversations with Black women, with people of color every day around work and work life and all these things. And there are so many who said, to this day, almost a year in, my company has said nothing. They've done nothing. There's been no tangible changes. So by you saying, oh, well, I don't, you being the organization saying, I don't want to do anything, I don't want to look opportunistic, your silence, your inaction is also saying something. And so would you rather people say something because you're trying to move in the right direction, and maybe you made a mistake, or maybe people are making assumptions or whatever, or would you rather someone say anything because you just stayed stagnant and done nothing? And so I think it's just time to get over it. Okay, if you're starting from scratch and there's no people of color in your organization and you were hiring your first one, yes, some people are going to think it's tokenism. Some people are going to think you're opportunistic. Okay, let's move on and think about the greater good. What are we trying to achieve? And we have to start somewhere. And so, yes, your motives matter in all of this. It's not just about checking boxes, but if you are coming from the right place, if you're doing the right things, if you're engaging with the right kind of expertise, then take that first step, and you got to get over it, is what I would say.
So start us off when, this is like step one in your pure purview. Can we define, this is one of the questions I always hear, what are we talking about when the term is, diversity and inclusion? Is it cultural, racial, religious? Help me define this term. What are we talking about when we're talking about diversity and inclusion?
Well, I'm really glad that you asked that, because I think so much of this work is about getting comfortable with the words and the language to have these kinds of conversations. For us right now at this moment, we are focused on racial diversity, and in particular, addressing disparities in opportunities for Black people. And I really believe that it's important, especially right now at this moment when our country and the business community is more engaged, that we keep that focus front and center. And that doesn't mean I'm disregarding all the other measures of diversity. They're important. I'm passionate about them. But right now, I believe we need to keep our foot on the gas in terms of making real changes and opportunities for Black people.
And is that the first step for internal communicators to, okay, define what is it that we are talking about here?
I'm a big believer in shared language, and we need to understand where we're coming from. So to me, if you're a communicator and you're in charge of all of the content and things that are coming out around a certain topic, no matter what that topic is, but especially a topic that's so emotionally charged, then absolutely starting with common language and definitions, I think, is ideal.
Okay. So today, that's what we're going to tackle. That was your work with Anne. Is the proper term racial diversity?
So even before that, I think I'd love to just define diversity, equity, and inclusion. Like we talk about D&I, we say DEI, we say diversity work, and I think it kind of just lumps everything together. And so when we're talking about diversity, we're talking about the representation and the distribution across various dimensions of identity. So that is cultural, that's gender, that's race, that's all of those things that you mentioned earlier. We're talking about the representation and what the numbers look like. When we're talking about equity, we're then talking about making sure that there are no differences in outcomes based on these diversity dimensions. So when we talk about outcomes in hiring, outcomes in pay, outcomes in belonging, all of these different things that make up workplace culture, we want to make sure that if I'm a woman, I'm not going to have a different outcome in my promotion trajectory than if I were a man. Or if I'm Black, it's not going to be that I'm less likely to get a pay increase versus if I was white, right? And so we want to make sure that the processes that we have in place ensure equity. And finally, there's inclusion. And this is our employees' perception that they are valued and that they belong at work. And this is at the foundation of what we talk about when we're thinking about culture. And how we should be looking at this as organizations, as communicators, is that we want every single employee, all employees, to feel like they belong. We want all employees to feel like they're included, that they're valued, their contributions matter in the organization. What we see, though, is because of our history as a country, our history as the world, that there are disparities. And there's so much research. There's, even if you do an engagement surveys at your organizations, what I found is that like literally, I can literally bet money on it if I wanted to, that people of color, specifically Black folks, even more specifically Black women, experience their organizations less favorably than anyone else. I've seen this play out in healthcare, in higher education, in tech, in financial services. This is what it is. And so when we're talking about what do we do to get to this space of inclusion, while yes, we want everyone to feel included, it's very clear that in certain organizations, there are specific identities, racial identities, that do not feel included. So we need to figure out, how do we level the playing field?
Okay. Well, keep going here with us, and then I'm going to have Ann jump in. So again, our listeners all right, give me a checklist. Put this in order of what I can do. So I love when you say, hey, you can look at this from the lens of the culture, because culture is how people feel. So that's good. And then, I don't want to gloss over this, because we talk about internal communicators are now very data driven. The ones that listen to our show are very innovative and they thrive on data. Is that where they get tripped up? Like if people are starting and beginning to do this work, is that where they start? Like, what is the first step, or what mistakes have you seen people make?
Yeah, this is such a good question. And I think that one of the biggest mistakes is people just seeing this as, and no pun intended, but just black and white, right? And that it's either this or that. It's either we're data driven or we're anecdotal, and it's all of these things. And yes, there are a checklist, so to speak, and things you can do, but then there's not. You have to feel your way into it. And so I think the first thing to really enter into this conversation is to know that there's no one size fits all. Yes, there are guiding principles. Yes, there are best practices. Yes, there are things that have worked for other organizations, but your culture, specifically at your organization, is different from other people's cultures. And so what worked at Google is not necessarily going to work at Brilliant Inc. There's two completely different cultures and needs and nuances there. And so really just approaching this as something that we're going to learn into. We're going to, yes, have a map, but we're still going to be flexible, I think, is one of the things that people typically don't do. And then I think another mistake that organizations make, and even communicators specifically, is underestimating the fact that people of color, these communities, there needs to be a level of understanding that trust is broken. How do we rebuild trust? How do we make sure that people see that there is a shift, that there is something new that's going to be happening when we go through this process? And then I think the final mistake is approaching this as trying to solve racism and solve inequity instead of approaching it as trying to navigate the inequality and the racism that's here. These companies are microcosms of larger societies, right? And those are wrought with inequity and inequality and all of these things. And so it's not about, we can't solve it as an organization per se, but we need to understand how to navigate it. We need to understand how to, when there's still a subset of people who don't believe that we should be talking about this, how do we circumvent that? How do we still work within it? And so I think really thinking about those three things can really help push forward a meaningful approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
I love this. I love that you gave us three things, and I love that you gave us the empathetic side, because again, internal communicators will get this. They write for an audience, they want to understand their audience. So it would make sense to say you need to spend some time understanding that. And so for you to speak to that about the broken trust, oh, it's so good. Okay. I'm in it. All right, Anne, where did you and your team, where did you start?
Yeah, it's been a journey, and the reality is that different people come on the journey at different levels of readiness. And Brilliant Inc. is a small business. You know, we only have about 10 full-time employees and 10 contractors. That is a small company, and therefore we don't have an HR team. We don't have people that are trained in having these kinds of conversations. And so that was a hard place for us to start from. But again, we really followed Dorianne's advice in that we need to start. And I think one of the things that I've realized in this is that so much of the work that we've done and continue to do is actually about becoming more mature and sophisticated in our processes. And in fact, that's what we're seeing with more and more of our clients as we have conversations on this topic, is that by taking a closer look at your own processes, the way that you go out and find candidates, the way that you sort and decide who to interview and then interview and hire and onboard people, by looking closely at that and ensuring that you are being equitable in those processes, it benefits everyone. It benefits the company. It really is about taking a more fair and equitable approach. It's not about any one audience. Now, you do want to make sure that you are going out and targeting specific audiences where it's appropriate, but in large part, it was helping my team understand that this is about scaling and growing as an organization on many levels. So that's been a big part of it. And the training, honestly, was a very big part of it as well. So we went through a series of a number of training sessions with Dorianne. As she explained to us, it's not a one and done. It's not something we can do in one session or two sessions. It's actually something that it needs to be done over time. The content is heavy and it's difficult, and it's important to do it and commit to doing it and then space it out over time. And what I have seen on my team is just such an evolution in terms of mindset, in terms of confidence, and in terms of having that ability to have those hard conversations. One other thing that's been really helpful for us is also identifying those people within our organization that need maybe a little bit more help because of the role that they have. So if there's someone on my team who is responsible for hiring and who is responsible for posting jobs and things like that, they need more support. If we have a manager who is going to be managing our first employee of color, they need more support. And so identifying those people and offering it to them, not as you did something wrong, but actually as a benefit, to have a partner like Dorianne to help them and support them along the way makes such a huge difference.
So give me an example of maybe something that you learned, like what were you doing before when you were, let's take the targeting specific roles. What were you doing before? And then how did your learning manifest? What does it look like now to make that the targeting more fair and equitable?
Such a great question. I mean, really up to this point in our history, most of the people that work with us have come through personal connections and referrals. So
someone I know, whether it's a friend or a family member, recommended someone else or someone I used to work with, really through that personal connection, which has been great at doing one thing, which is hiring more people that are like me. And that has worked really well. And now I have a team where we joke like we can finish each other's sentences and we could read each other's minds. And that's not to say that we're not different. And that's not to say that innovation isn't happening, but that has been probably one of the biggest changes that I've discovered. And so we have really made an attempt to not only formalize our hiring process, so making sure that everyone, no matter where they're coming from, if there's someone we know or someone we don't, they're going through the same process. They're seeing the same job description, they're applying in the same way, they're being vetted in the same way, and also making sure that we're going out and making our opportunities more broadly available in places that we haven't before. So that means not just posting jobs on LinkedIn, not just sharing them with our own personal networks, but finding those places that target a more diverse candidate and making sure that our jobs are posted there. Not only that, through this experience of interviewing the dozen or so DEI consultants and continuing to speak on this topic and lead panel discussions, I have greatly diversified my own network, and I am constantly asking, can you please share this job with people in your network? And so by diversifying my own personal network, I'm making sure that I am reaching more people with those jobs.
All right. Is there something that you can point out to say, all right, you go down this road, this is the first thing you need to remember when you tackle this? I'd love to toss to both of you on this.
Yeah, I think for me, really the important piece is tapping into that personal connection and really taking time. This is not something that you can sit at your desk and just crank out. You really have to do a lot of personal, hard reflection, which I know a lot of people have been doing since this summer and onward. I just think taking time to read and listen and journal and reflect on why this is important to you and what is that difference that you can make. That is what you need in your back pocket, because it will be hard and you will bump up against resistance from leadership, from questions that you don't have the answers to the first time. You really have to go in recognizing that this is going to be a marathon. It's going to be hard. And to me, the best training that I personally had was to define what is that personal meaning for me and what is it for my company that we want to achieve, because that has now been my guiding light every time I do come up against these really hard questions.
Dorianne, what would you say is the most important thing they need to remember while doing this work?
To remember that you have blind spots, and we all do, right? And so as an internal communicator, you're no different in that your worldview, your upbringing, the media you consume, the people that are in your inner circle, all of these things have influenced how you see the world, how you see the workplace, how you see this topic of diversity and inclusion, how you see communication. And because of that, there are different perspectives that you likely aren't seeing. And so to me, the first thing, if you truly want to communicate in a way that is inclusive, is to understand, what is my worldview? How do I think about this topic? Why do I think this way? And really uncover what your blind spots potentially could be, so that you can really dive into this conversation. When we talk about communicators writing things or doing emails or prepping their leaders for what to say, etc., you're bringing yourself, even if you're writing on behalf of someone else, on behalf of a company or whatever it is, you're bringing yourself into that exchange. And so it's really important for you to know yourself and where you stand when it comes to this work, so that you can be bringing the right parts of yourself into the conversation. And so just understanding that when we're talking about inclusion, when we're talking about policies, when we're talking about culture, and you have to communicate about these things, there are very different implications for people of color at the workplace. And if you're not taking those into account, if you're just talking about, oh, we're rolling out this new hiring process and this is the things that we're going to do and you should know about this, have you taken into account how other people could perceive this? Have you thought about what perspectives potentially are missing from the communication or the research that went into the communication? Have you thought about whose voices we're amplifying by this communication and whose are we silencing? There's a lot of different nuances, I think, that needs to be taken into consideration. And I think what it boils down to is understanding that this role of internal communication is huge. It's a lot of power. Don't second guess yourself to think that, oh, this is just, something I'm doing and I don't really have a say, and how do I push back? You have the power. This is a powerful role. And so I think stepping into it, taking it seriously, identifying what your blind spots are, and then communicating with that in mind is, to me, the first thing that needs to be done.
Oh, I love that. And I love you saying that about our listeners, that they do have the power. I'm always reminded of, my favorite biblical story was Esther, like for such a time as this, she was there at the right place at the right time. And I feel so strongly about that with our audience, with, the internal communicator. And so many of them care so deeply. I want to dive a little bit deeper into this question. How does workplace culture impact people of color? So how would things that, a lack of inclusion, how does that manifest? What does that look like? Can you point out like, hey, these might be spots that could be canaries in the mind if this is an issue in your company?
I don't even know where to start. Like everything. So if I had to narrow it down, like even policies around communication. So at this organization, the way we communicate is that we do Slack messages and we, this is how we interact, and we use these emojis and we do all these things. Well, how did we determine what slang is used at our company, or what emojis are cool, or what the channel should be, etc.? Who created that? Was it a diverse mix of people, or was it the 2 or 3 founders who were white men who came from the same college kind of background, and so they decided that this is what we want to do and this is how we communicate? And not that Slack in and of itself or internal, that is wrong, but there's this the way in which white I'm trying not to say bro culture. I don't know how else to say it though, but the way in which like that is communicated and how they communicate is not the same that me from Brooklyn, Black girl, immigrant, Jamaican parents, that I communicate. Yes, I've had to learn how to communicate in that way in order to be successful in my career, but it's just not the same. And so just even slang terminology, how we talk about our weekends, simple things like that, we don't take into account that people of color may not feel comfortable in the spaces that are occupied by largely white folks because I don't know who that band is. I don't know what show you're talking about. Nope, I didn't vacation in the Hamptons. I didn't do these. I'm not relating with you. And so you tell me to bring my authentic self. You tell me to show up and communicate and be chipper and do all these things on Slack and all this stuff. But I don't feel comfortable. And I think that people they underestimate that because you don't have to think about it. As a Black woman, I have to think about, how do I wear my hair? How do I say it? Am I saying too many ain'ts and can't, slang it, too much slang? Am I being too much, too loud, too this, too that? Literally, this goes through my mind all the time when I'm at work. And other folks don't necessarily have to think about that. And so how that impacts how I show up. It impacts, do I want to speak in a meeting? It impacts what I wear. It impacts who I'm friends with. It impacts so much. And so just something like that, if we think also about hiring, the policy that we are going to get the best and the brightest from these 5 colleges, these 5 Ivy League institutions. Well, if we take a step back, we know that historically these Ivy League institutions excluded people of color. Maybe they let a few in at a time, but that's not where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. What about all of the other places where top-notch candidates and top-notch talent have come from or have worked, or maybe they didn't even go to college, but they have the equivalent of all this experience that you need? Where are we looking? Are we excluding people just from our process in the name of being the best and doing all of these things and having this false sense of this is what good looks like and this is what undesirable looks like. One of the key themes that came through in the training that I do, and I did this with Brilliant Inc., is around a lot of what we know about the corporate world, about this space, is rooted in white supremacy. It was created by white folks for white folks. And they did not create it with Dorianne, this Black girl, in mind so that she can reach the top and become the CEO of Walgreens, right? Which is amazing that this, that we're seeing this happen right now. That's not how it was created. And so a lot of policies, practices, the perspectives we have that have trickled down over this time, they were not created with people of color in mind. And so there are implications for that. And so organizations must go through and seriously go through and audit our processes, our HR policies, our handbook, our code of conduct, how we interact, our culture. How do all of these things impact people based on their identities? And it's right there. If you ask the question, you'll get the answers. If you do the surveys, you'll see where the discrepancies are. It impacts so much. We just need to pay attention.
So good. And how did your team react to the idea of the history and the huge implications that we're just in default, right? So many of us are self-absorbed. You said, hey, I was an entrepreneur 5 years trying to make my business survive. And now to kind of get that cold glass of water to the face and the reality of the history behind that. That's so good, Dorianne. Ann, how did you react? And what was the reaction from your team on that realization, that awakening?
I wouldn't say it's done. It's a constant journey that we are still understanding as we are going through the process right now. I said we're a company of 10 and we're planning to hire 5 people this year. That's small growth to most companies, but percentage wise, that's tremendous. And so we are in it right now, and we are seeing it as candidates come in, and we are having to really continue to hold ourselves to those standards and expectations that we set. And I think one of the other really big learnings that we had with Dorianne was the need to examine some of those unspoken things that are happening within our organization that every organization has. How you talk on Slack, your different Slack channels, the expectations that you have of one another. You have to look at those unwritten rules. And if something isn't clear, you need to write it down and you need to state it. And organizations that we partner with where they have those employee resource groups are an invaluable resource of insight for you to be able to go and talk to and say, how did this land? What could we do better? What are we missing? What are we not thinking about? I led a panel discussion on this topic just last week with someone who has internal communications in their title and suddenly now also has diversity, equity, and inclusion. And she said, you know what? I don't know enough to do this on my own. I want a committee. I want a group of people that can be my sounding board that I can go back to. And that's been a really important piece of this as well.
Hey, that panel that Ann was just talking about, it took place at the Advanced Learning Institute Conference, ALI. And all of our listeners get $100 off any of their events. All you have to do is use the promo code ALIICPRO. The Internal Comms Pro Collective is proudly supported by Circle Broadcast. Today we're talking about DEI, and you have so much great information for employees who may want to join an employee resource group or go to an event, but as well as I do, they do not want to dig through their inbox or sift through their intranet. With Circle Broadcast cross-channel distribution, your employees have that information at their fingertips, and with universal search, they can find it at a moment's notice. Head over to circle.com/ICP to learn more. That's CERKL.com/ICP. Ann and Dorianne make such a dynamic team. So you might be thinking about you and your team. Now, knowing what we've learned today, it is important to know where to start. In this next part, I ask if starting with a quick win or designing a big old comprehensive strategy is better. Let's find out our guest's take on this. Well, and I think you're giving so many ideas, I think, to our listeners where they want to know, where do I start? Would you recommend them doing, depending on where you are in the organization, starting with something that you personally have control over and can change? Or do you recommend coming up with an entire big old comprehensive program, laying it out and being more strategic and thoughtful about it?
At the very least, everyone are in the seat they're in, you can figure out what is it that you control, where your influence lies, and do something to that effect, right? In my seat as an HR business partner, before I was doing all of this, and any of the leaders that I worked with, we're embedding inclusion in what we do. So you're hiring these people. I ran some numbers on behind the scenes. It's not looking right. Here's the list again. Let's figure this out. Maybe I didn't come to them as strongly in some cases if this wasn't a priority of my organization, but I found ways to embed that work into what I'm doing. And then in other situations, because of my reputation, because of my standing, because of my level, then I was able to push back and really say, okay, we need a whole new strategy. We need to do this. And so it just depends on all of the various variables and things that are at stake. But at the very least, especially in your role as a communicator, you have influence. And so use whatever influence you do have to push this work forward. I think that's really important. But again, don't underestimate your power. Don't underestimate the fact that you have people's ear in this season. And so push back and think about, how can we make this a larger strategic vision instead of piecemeal that we're doing things. But to me, some inclusion is better than no inclusion. So if we can't do the big strategy, then fine, let's figure out what the baby steps can be.
Yeah, I think that the one of the best baby steps that you mentioned is to ask the question when they are putting out communication, what worldview is this from? And to consider that, am I projecting my own personal view in this situation? I think that tips like that are so, so good. And I want to go back to the panel. I was there that day when you brilliantly moderated the panel at the ALI conference, and I thought one of the best sound bites and tips that came out of that panel was intent versus impact. Talk about that. That I thought that was such a good tip for the audience. You could have great intent, but what is the impact of what you're doing? Talk about that a little bit.
I think one of the biggest things, again, if we think about the span of influence of all of your listeners collectively, that, whether you sit in a company-wide internal communications role or some, tangential role, the collective impact of everybody listening to this is massive. We as communicators can touch the experience of so many different people, and really making sure that the work that we're doing is making a difference. There is no reason for shying away from this. We all have the opportunity to do meaningful work and to make a difference with the words that we're putting out. And quite frankly, I also think this isn't a time to worry about swim lanes. If you see something that you think is not working well or could be done better on the HR side of the house, and you're in internal communications, that doesn't mean that you can't raise your hand and share your observations or offer to help or provide your support. I mean, there are so many different ways that you can make a difference. One of the biggest things is think about your next big company meeting. Look at the people who speak at your company meetings. Is there diversity there? Who's being invited up on stage to talk to employees? There are just so many big and little ways that communicators have that influence and are able to make that difference. Mm-hmm. But I also think it's really important to make sure that leadership is ready to hear what people are going to tell you and to be able to act on it, because there's nothing worse than giving people the opportunity to share their perspectives and nothing happening with it. You want to be able to give people that opportunity to share their feedback, and you need to be ready for it. You may not like what you hear. When you open up the door for that, you have to be prepared for the possibility that what you're going to hear is difficult. Anytime we talk to an organization that is saying that they want to make a difference in this space, we always really look for that leadership commitment, because it's not a campaign. It's not a slogan. It's not anything like that. It is truly changing at the core of the organization. And if you're not ready for that, then I think even asking for the perspectives and insights of others is destined to fall on its face.
So good. Anne, what do you think internal communicators might miss when approaching this kind of work?
Data is key. So do your homework and look at some of the things that either the company has said in the past or certain metrics that the company is struggling with, whether it's attrition, whether it's look at the customers that you serve in the marketplace. What is their feedback? Look at your competitors. I think that's a huge one. Leaders are definitely motivated by data and by comparisons. And so anything that you can do to really show these are the benefits that we stand to gain, and this is the risk that we face if we stay quiet. It's a huge risk. And there's so much data, so many examples out there of companies that are staying quiet. And you have a responsibility to raise those concerns to your leaders and make sure that they stay front and center.
Now we're off to a great start with Ann and Dorianne, but you know me, I want a framework. Now that I'm getting the grasp on the high level, the head level, the heart level, I want to go now to the pro level, and I'm ready to roll up my sleeves and get to work. So our podcast takes us to Iceland and London, where I found two internal comms experts. Mike Klein, he's the principal of Changing the Terms, a boutique internal and social communications consultancy based in Iceland. I also found Gihan Hyde, founder and CEO of a corporate communication social enterprise startup named Communique. She is based in the UK. Now they've come up with the Communication Hat framework that provides the exact organizing framework to take what we've learned from Ann and Dorianne and put it into practice. This guide will also help you craft your DEI conversations. Now let's dive in as Gihan is describing how the hat strategy was born.
Okay, so what prompted me was the fact that because of my marketing background, I am used to personalizing the messages according to my audience. But what I wasn't aware of clearly is how different people wear different hats. That didn't come naturally to me until I started speaking to my clients who are founders of small to medium companies. And I've noticed that they are tackling a lot of hats at the same time. And this is when I realized, oh my God, we've been doing something wrong here from an internal communications point of view. We really need to now take a step back and reflect on the different hats, on A, to identify what the hats are, and B, to identify what messages and what tones each hat would be able to relate to.
All right, so this is making sense. Walk me through the next part of the journey together when you were developing these. What walk us through each hat and what each one represents and what messages they should focus on. So I know we've got both of you here and having someone in Iceland. And Gihan, where are you physically located? Tell me again.
I'm in London.
And you're in London. Okay, so we've got this, which that's another thing that our listeners, by the way, have really requested. They love this outside perspective, this global perspective. So I'm excited to get into this.
Let me pick up the next phase of this because I think it benefits from one person kind of creating the story from end to end and then building on that together. But I think the key thing in the evolution and the development of the initial set of 5 communication hats is that I've been working with 2 of the hats for the last 10 years. When I wrote my book on social communication called From Lincoln to LinkedIn, um, I really came into 2 separate roles that nobody in the internal comms world or the business world were really talking about openly. One was the role of the employee as a citizen, and the role of the employee as a tribe member. And so a lot of my practice for the last 10 plus years has been to try to get people to focus on, treating employees like citizens, people who have a choice, people who have, some say in what they do and what goes on around them. And as tribe members, people who have affiliations and interests and senses of community that go beyond the boxes and lines of the organizational chart. What I discovered in talking with Gihan particularly was realizing that this set of two hats was missing something big time. And so together we developed a set of 5 hats, which describe kind of the levels and depth of engagement that employees have within organizations. So the first hat is the subordinate hat, which is you are told what to do and you communicate to somebody by telling somebody what to do and expecting it to be done without any friction. So the first hat is the subordinate hat. The second hat is the customer hat, where the employee has a certain amount of choice, but that choice may be to leave the organization if they don't like what's being offered or to go somewhere else. Just as if you don't like one brand of cornflakes, you don't change that brand of cornflakes. You buy another brand of cornflakes or something else for breakfast. The third, which is a higher level of engagement, but a very specialized level of engagement, is that of the investor or the shareholder. Somebody who's got a financial stake, and somebody perhaps who has a more global looking view at the financial impact of an organization beyond perhaps the balance sheet. I would still consider them in that investor shareholder bucket. Then you have the citizen bucket, where people have choice, they have discretion, they have to make decisions, they need to be persuaded, and organizations have to, accept the consequences of whether people are persuaded or not. And this actually came out of my experience working in Europe. I've lived and worked in Europe for most of the last 20 years. And unlike in the US, where you have at-will employment, where you can basically say to somebody, go away for no reason, in Europe, employees are structurally represented in organizational decision-making process. And so there's a tone, there's an approach, there are boxes that need to be ticked in every major piece of communication. And so the final piece is the tribe member. And that's really about the invisible groups. It can be anybody from the people who came into an organization in the same year, the people who went to the same university, people who support the same sports team, people who have the same religion. You wear a crucifix to the office. Part of what you're doing is projecting yourself out to other people who have similar beliefs to kind of create community and kinship in that environment. And you look at these together as your basic set of communication hats. And the reason why we brought this up was that a lot of organizations communicate with people as subordinates or as customers or as shareholders, when in fact the hat that the employee is wearing is that of the citizen or the tribe member.
Gihan, you have anything to add here?
So I echo what Mike has said. And I think as well, because both Mike and I have worked in international markets, Mike was in Europe, and as he said, he's from the US, whereas I was mainly focused on the Middle East, for example. I'm from Sudan originally. So the hats will differ, and there are more hats, but we just chose these 5 hats to start off with. And the way we approach these hats and the messages for each hat will need to be tailored according to where the companies are based as well. So please be mindful of that. And the way I describe it is, so there is a theory by a professor in Stanford University, where she asks people, 2 groups of people, one to think of a song and tap it, and the other group is to figure out what are the songs. And it didn't make, and the results were mind-blowing, because the people who were tapping thought that they were very clear in the way they tapped, because they can hear the song in their mind. Whereas the people who were listening to the tapping, it was like an SOS, a Morse code. It just didn't make any sense. And this is why we tried our best, Mike and I, to help our fellow internal communicators to focus on certain messages that we need to address for each hat. So for example, if you are talking to a subordinate, your messages could be around authority, i.e. reinforcing why the decision has been made and who has made that decision. But if you are talking to the citizen hat, always focus on messages around self-help. So how are your messages going to help them? How are they going to be involved in the decision making? And how will they be able to celebrate the success of these messages? But if you're talking to a tribal hat, a tribe member hat, the messages could be around belonging, because again, as a tribal member, you want to feel that you're part of a group. Your identity is basically based on you being part of that group. So your messaging could be around belonging. It could be around how the leaders are respecting you. And it also could be around the greater good. So again, it's all about how would these messages land with you as a person when it comes to the tribal. And lastly, if you are talking to the investor hat, for example, focus on data, focus on the business growth, and what role would the employee be playing as part of that. Because as an investor hat, the last thing you want to do is to make them feel helpless or feel stressed out, because they have invested so much in your company, whether by time served, whether by pension. So be mindful that when you are writing to these investor hats, that you focus on the data by explaining to them where the decision came from, how it's going to result in the business growth. So these are the type of messages that we should be focusing on.
Yeah, well, and this would have been so good, I think, too, with the turbulent 2020 year. I mean, with the political unrest and all of the racial unrest, and then the with COVID. Walk me through how this might work with some of these more timely issues. But boy, this framework seems like this would be a nice tool to have in my tool belt. Talk about this from the diversity, equity, and inclusion lens of things.
Well, this really has diversity, equity, and inclusion, particularly diversity and inclusion, baked deeply throughout its DNA. Because it's interesting here living in Iceland, where the ethnic population is about 95% or 90% Icelandic, and there's not much visual diversity here. But you know, you have an election with 9 different parties, and the tribe membership, becomes the predominant characteristic of life here for about 3 months. And each of these characteristics, are you a subordinate? Are you a customer? Are you an investor? Are you a citizen, or are you a tribe member? That's a diversity framework. It's not a traditional diversity framework, because it's not based on a lot of the traditional thinking around diversity. But if you apply this alongside the traditional diversity frameworks, you have a much more robust way of looking and way of creating some dynamism in your organization than just simply seeing it as an issue of age, gender, or color.
Absolutely. And should we speak to, and when we ask the employees which hats do they think they fall under, it also opens a whole new world to D&I, because we get to actually listen to the employees and see what do they relate to, what are their beliefs, what are their aspirations, what are their dreams and hopes, for example. So this framework is definitely a start, as Mike said, is a combination with the old way of measuring D&I with this new ways of measuring D&I.
And inclusion isn't just about formal inclusion processes. Inclusion is about asking people questions who don't normally get asked, and then acting on their answers when they don't normally get acted on. And certainly when you're looking at the communication hats, you can't do this successfully unless you're doing both of those.
Well, and it puts words and structure towards, well, how do I implement a more empathetic approach to communication, which is what we're called even more than ever now to do. So I can't thank you enough for putting that lens on this. And again, giving us something that we can actually use today to improve that part of our internal comm strategy.
Yeah, I think we've put a new lens into the way internal comms, ways of working, and the mindset as well. Because if you think about it, Sarah, it's all about a mindset. So understanding the different mindsets, the different attributes, the different attitudes of each hat would help us really have and cement our seat on that table. There's so much noise out there. People's attention span, and they're being bombarded by so much messages. The least we can do at this moment of time is to try and understand which hat do we want to address, and what is important to each hat. By doing that, we're not only increasing the level of efficiency, but also the level of effectiveness. I mean, the data is telling us that personalization and individualization of a message results in employee engagement. And the data is also supporting the fact that if employees feel that they are heard and valued and treated in a specific way, their productivity level would increase by 21%. Whereas, again, the data is telling us if we talk to them in the hat that we want them to think about, 69% of the employees within an organization will work harder. So this moment of time is the most important time for us to sit and really reflect on which hats we want people to be thinking on, and what messages should be addressed to which hat.
And I think to talk about the dynamics of that, what you're really looking at is a basic alignment issue between what hat are you wearing as the sender, for lack of a better term, as the sender, as the speaker, what hats are the various group of respondents or recipients wearing in the organization, and then how to get the appropriate message to the appropriate group in the appropriate way when those hats are actually invisible.
I think these are such good points. When I'm doing this, however, how do I know, or how do I measure if my message hit just right or wasn't successful? Or is there some kind of baseline data I need to capture before I go down this road?
Benchmarks are not going to get you anywhere in this game because each organization is a distinct enough organism. There's a lot of benchmarking, particularly in the employee engagement space, where you've got two oil companies and you benchmark them against each other. The only problem is one of them's in Holland and one of them's in Houston, and the entire cultural backdrop, the hat, the hat array, for lack of a better term, is completely different. But you can use, by asking certain questions. The key is to ask people what they think of a certain issue, why they think that, what they think the organization's priorities are, and what they should be. You ask those four questions at various stages of this conversation, like before you share the message, after you share the message, and as the message either gets rejected or accepted by the organization. You can measure the words that people use. You can measure the individual words, you can measure the tone, the sentiment. Certainly a lot of what I do in my business is looking at qualitative research around sentiment, around language, around issues. But that gives you an ability to look at this stuff in a meaningful and a quantifiable way, as opposed to just simply, seeing it as a nice idea that you're throwing up in the air.
Whereas I work very closely with HR to measure my work, because I think the majority of times we fail to work closely with HR because we don't realize how powerful the data that HR has. So for example, yes, we're going to address each hat once we figure out what each hat is asking of us. But if we are addressing a hat, let's say a subordinate hat, and the problem we're trying to solve is absenteeism and lack of engagement, or even a big turnaround in employees, for example, I would work very closely to see what was the result, what was the data before we started communicating to the subordinates, and then how did the message land according to Mike's techniques, but then also how did that affect the actual problem that we're trying to solve. We need to start upskilling ourselves to cope with the new world. We can't keep on depending on clicks and views or number of visits, for example. I think the future for internal comms is for us to upskill ourselves from a data analysis and from a critical point of view, an analytical point of view as well. And that is what's going to make and bring these hats to life.
Mike, how can we become more analytical and make time for that within these positions that are just so underwater, churning out work?
Well, one, can I ask a question? Can I swear?
Absolutely. Hell yeah.
Well, there's the classic concept that assumption is the mother of all fuck ups. And what this is a tool to do is to give every communicator, and indeed every exec, 5 questions to ask before every engagement. One is, who am I talking to? Am I talking to a subordinate, someone who thinks they're a customer, someone who thinks they're a shareholder, someone who thinks they're a citizen, or someone who thinks like a tribe member? If you ask those 5 questions before you put pen to paper or, fingers to keyboard, then you've got a much, if you just do that one thing, your odds of success are going to be a lot better than if you treat people like shareholders when they're acting like citizens.
I think for me, Sarah, is that we really need to start taking a step back. And yes, we're snowed under. Yes, we're burnt out. But if we don't take a step back and really think think like the employee and which hat we want to address, we will fail in achieving the success that we deserve. And what we also realize is that employees right now are extremely demanding, and they want a good and a meaningful experience when they're working for a company. And it's our job to be the glue to bring them together and to increase the growth of a company.
Well, I appreciate both of your vulnerability and sharing the answers to those questions. And I think it really speaks to where this field is going. There really is an art and a science to it, so many nuances that to pick up on that. To try to put all that together using both sides of the brain and psychology and data, it really is the new way of I would say ingredients to be successful. Like I said, to meet the demands of the employees who expect a superior experience. I can't thank you enough for taking the time with our listeners today to provide such a great framework.
Thank you for having us, Sarah.
My pleasure.
Well, there you have it, folks. You can now confidently start this important work. Now, we'll put links to all the resources from Ann, Dorianne, Mike, and Gihan in today's show notes. Also, feel free to connect with each of them on LinkedIn. Now, next week, we have a treat for you. In honor of International Women's Day, we will be talking to 3 of the top female pioneers in the internal comms world. It is definitely one you do not want to miss. Stay with us as our journey to up-level your internal communications to pro level continues.
Internal Comms Pro, the podcast, is produced by the Internal Comms Pro Collective and proudly supported by the Circle Broadcast Suite, an entire suite built for internal communicators. Learn more at circle.com. And don't forget to visit www.internalcommspro.com/show notes for our free resource guides. Thank you for listening.